When single father David drove his drunk, abusive boss home after she humiliated him at the office party, he never expected her morning confession to shatter his world forever. The woman who destroyed his life was about to reveal a secret that would test the very limits of human forgiveness. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. David Miller adjusted his tie one last time before entering the gleaming office building. At 32, he carried the weight of responsibility on his shoulders like a heavy coat he could never take off. Single father to 8-year-old Emma, he worked as an accountant at Harrison & Associates, one of the city's most prestigious firms. The company Christmas party was in full swing on the 42nd floor. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over employees in their finest clothes, laughter mixing with the soft jazz playing in the background. David stood near the refreshment table, nursing a glass of sparkling water, watching his colleagues celebrate. Miller. The sharp voice cut through the festive atmosphere. Victoria Harrison, the company's ruthless CEO, approached with unsteady steps. Her usually perfect appearance was disheveled, her expensive dress slightly wrinkled, and her eyes held that glassy look of someone who had consumed far too much alcohol. Mrs. Harrison, David nodded respectfully, though his stomach tightened. Victoria had made his life miserable for the past 2 years, constantly criticizing his work, passing him over for promotions, and treating him like he was disposable. "You're not drinking," she slurred, swaying slightly. "What's wrong with you? Can't afford the good stuff on your pathetic salary?" Several colleagues nearby turned to watch, some with pity in their eyes, others with the uncomfortable fascination people have when witnessing a train wreck. David's face burned with embarrassment, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm driving tonight, Mrs. Harrison. I need to get home to my daughter." Victoria laughed, a harsh sound that made people nearby flinch. "Oh yes, the single daddy act. Always rushing home to your little princess. Maybe if you stayed late once in a while, you'd actually be worth something to this company." David's hands clenched at his sides, but he said nothing. He couldn't afford to lose this job. Emma depended on him for everything, her school fees, her clothes, the small apartment they called home. He had learned long ago that sometimes survival meant swallowing your pride. The party continued around them, but the atmosphere had shifted. People were pretending not to notice the uncomfortable scene unfolding, though David could feel their eyes on him. Victoria continued her verbal assault, each word designed to cut deep. "You know what your problem is, Miller? You're weak. Pathetic. Your wife probably left because she realized what a loser she married." The mention of his late wife Sarah hit David like a physical blow. Sarah hadn't left, she had died in a car accident 3 years ago, leaving him to raise Emma alone. Victoria knew this. She had used his grief against him before, but never so publicly, never so cruelly. "That's enough," David said quietly, his voice carrying a warning that made Victoria pause for just a moment. But she was too drunk, too mean, too used to crushing people beneath her expensive heels to stop now. "Oh, did I hit a nerve? The truth hurts, doesn't it? Face it, Miller, you're a failure as a husband, as a father, and definitely as an employee." The party had grown quiet around them. Even the jazz music seemed muted. David looked around at his colleagues, people he had worked with for years, people he had helped with projects, covered for when they were sick, shared coffee and conversations with. Not one of them spoke up. They all just stood there, watching his humiliation with uncomfortable silence. David took a deep breath and made a decision that would surprise everyone, including himself. "Mrs. Harrison," he said calmly, "you're very drunk. Let me drive you home." Victoria blinked in confusion, clearly not expecting this response. "What? You're in no condition to drive. It's dangerous. Let me take you home safely." The offer hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria's assistant, Jennifer, stepped forward nervously. "Mrs. Harrison, maybe you should." "I don't need help from anyone," Victoria snapped, but she was swaying more noticeably now. Especially not from him. David pulled out his phone and showed her a photo of Emma, a bright-eyed little girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. "This is my daughter Emma. 3 years ago, her mother died in a car accident caused by a drunk driver. I won't let that happen to someone else's family, not even for someone who treats me the way you do." The room was completely silent now. Victoria stared at the photo, something flickering across her face, surprise, maybe even shame, though it was quickly replaced by her usual hardness. "I don't need your pity," she muttered. "It's not pity," David replied. "It's called being human." For a long moment they stared at each other. Then Victoria's shoulders sagged slightly, and she seemed to realize that her legs weren't quite steady enough to carry her home safely. Fine, she said finally. But this doesn't change anything between us. David nodded and gently took her arm, guiding her toward the elevator. Behind them, he could hear the whispered conversation starting up again, but he didn't care. He had made his choice. The drive to Victoria's mansion in the hills was mostly silent. She sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, occasionally giving him directions in a voice that had lost its earlier venom. David focused on the road, thinking about Emma, who was staying with their neighbor Mrs. Chen for the evening. When they reached the imposing gates of Victoria's estate, she fumbled with the remote control. David waited patiently as she tried several times before finally getting it to work. "Thank you," she said quietly as he pulled up to the front door. It was the first time he had ever heard those words from her lips. "Get some water before you go to bed," David said. "And maybe some aspirin." Victoria nodded and got out of the car, but she didn't immediately go inside. Instead, she stood by the passenger door looking like she wanted to say something more. Finally, she just repeated, "Thank you," and walked unsteadily to her front door. David waited until she was safely inside before driving home. The next morning at the office, David expected the worst. He arrived early as always and settled at his desk to review the quarterly reports. Other employees trickled in, some giving him odd looks, others avoiding his eyes entirely. By 10 o'clock, Victoria still hadn't arrived, which was unusual for someone who prided herself on being the first one in every morning. Around 11, Jennifer approached his desk nervously. "David? Mrs. Harrison wants to see you in her office." David's stomach dropped. This was it. He was going to be fired for the scene at the party, for daring to treat the CEO like a human being instead of bowing and scraping as expected. He thought of Emma, of their modest apartment, of the stack of bills on his kitchen table. Victoria's office was a temple to success, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, expensive artwork, a desk that probably cost more than David made in 6 months. Victoria sat behind it, looking pale but put together, her armor of professionalism firmly in place. "Sit down," she said, not looking up from the papers in front of her. David sat and waited, his hands clasped in his lap to keep them from shaking. "About last night," Victoria began, still not meeting his eyes. "I may have had too much to drink." "Yes," David agreed quietly. "And I may have said some things that were inappropriate." David said nothing. They both knew her words had gone far beyond inappropriate. Victoria finally looked up at him, and for just a moment, her carefully constructed mask slipped. David saw something he had never seen before in her eyes, vulnerability, maybe even fear. "Why did you help me?" she asked. "After everything I've done to you, why would you drive me home?" David considered his answer carefully. "Because it was the right thing to do. And because I've seen what happens when people don't." Victoria nodded slowly, then reached into her desk drawer and pulled out an envelope. "Your Christmas bonus," she said, sliding it across the desk. David picked up the envelope, expecting the usual modest amount. Instead, he found a check for $10,000, more money than he had ever seen at one time. "Mrs. Harrison, this is too much." "No," she said firmly. "It's not enough. It will never be enough." Before David could ask what she meant, Victoria stood up and walked to the window, her back to him. "There's something I need to tell you, David. Something I should have told you a long time ago." David waited, confused by the sudden change in her demeanor. 3 years ago," Victoria continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "I was driving home from a business dinner. I had been drinking, not as much as last night, but enough that I shouldn't have been behind the wheel." David's blood turned to ice. Surely she wasn't about to say what he thought she was going to say. "There was an accident," Victoria continued, her voice breaking. "A woman in a small sedan. I hit her car." The world seemed to stop spinning. David couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what he was hearing. "I called 911, stayed until the paramedics arrived, but it was too late. She died on the way to the hospital." Victoria turned around, tears streaming down her face. Her name was Sarah Miller. David felt like he was falling through space. The room spun around him, and he gripped the arms of his chair to keep from collapsing. "No," he whispered. "No, that's not. The police said it was a hit and run. They never found the driver." Victoria's face crumpled. "I left the scene before the police arrived. I was scared, David. I was drunk and I was scared and I was a coward. I drove home and called my lawyer and he made it all go away. Money talks, David. It can make problems disappear, witnesses forget what they saw, evidence get lost." David stared at her, his mind reeling. All this time, all these years of working for the woman who had killed his wife, who had made Emma an orphan, who had destroyed their family and then had the audacity to treat him like dirt every single day. "You knew," he said, his voice hollow. "You knew who I was when you hired me." Victoria nodded miserably. "I found out after you started working here. When I saw your name on the employment records, when I realized who you were, I couldn't believe it. It felt like some kind of cosmic joke." "So you decided to torture me?" David's voice was getting stronger, anger beginning to replace shock. "You decided to make my life hell because you felt guilty?" "I don't know," Victoria cried. "I don't know why I did it. Maybe I thought if I could make you quit, if I could drive you away, I wouldn't have to face what I had done every single day. Maybe I thought I deserved to suffer, but I was too much of a coward to turn myself in, so I made you suffer instead." David stood up slowly, his legs unsteady. "You killed my wife. You made my daughter grow up without a mother. And then you had the nerve to insult Sarah's memory, to call me a failure as a husband, when you were the one who—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The rage was building inside him like a tsunami, threatening to sweep away everything in its path. "I know," Victoria whispered. "I know what I am. I know what I've done. Last night when you showed me Emma's picture, when you told me about Sarah, I wanted to die. I wanted to disappear." David looked at this woman who had haunted his nightmares, who had made his working life a misery, who had stolen his wife and his daughter's mother from them. She looked small now, broken, nothing like the powerful CEO who had terrorized him for years. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked. "Because you showed me kindness when I didn't deserve it. Because you saved me from potentially killing someone else the way I killed Sarah. Because I can't live with this secret anymore." Victoria walked to her desk and picked up a letter that had been sitting beside her keyboard. "This is my confession. Everything, what I did that night, how I covered it up, how I've treated you since. I'm going to give it to the police today." David stared at the letter, his mind racing. "You'll go to prison." "Yes," Victoria said simply. "I should have gone 3 years ago. The company will collapse without you. Maybe. Or maybe it will become something better." David thought about Emma, about the justice that had been denied to them for so long. He thought about the other families who might have been spared if Victoria had faced consequences for her actions years ago. He thought about the burden of secrets and how they could poison everything they touched. "I need to go," he said finally. Victoria nodded. "I understand if you never want to see me again. I understand if you hate me." David paused at the door. "I should hate you," he said without turning around. "Part of me does. But I also know that Sarah would want me to forgive. She would want Emma to grow up without the poison of hatred in her heart." He left the office and went home to Emma, who was getting ready for school. She looked up at him with Sarah's eyes and smiled, and David felt his heart break and heal at the same time. "Daddy, you look sad," Emma said, wrapping her small arms around his waist. "Sometimes grown-ups have complicated feelings, sweetheart," David said, hugging her tight. "But I'm okay. We're going to be okay." That afternoon the news broke. Victoria Harrison, CEO of Harrison & Associates, had turned herself into police in connection with a 3-year-old fatal hit-and-run case. The confession letter she provided detailed not only the accident but also the elaborate cover-up that had followed. David's phone rang constantly, reporters wanting his story, colleagues expressing shock and sympathy, lawyers discussing potential civil suits. He ignored most of them, focusing instead on Emma, who was confused by all the attention but seemed to sense that something important had happened. The trial lasted 6 months. Victoria pleaded guilty to all charges of vehicular manslaughter, leaving the scene of an accident, obstruction of justice, and several other related crimes. She was sentenced to 8 years in prison. During the sentencing hearing, David was given the opportunity to make a victim impact statement. He stood at the podium, looking out at the packed courtroom, and saw Victoria sitting at the defendant's table. She looked up at him, and for a moment their eyes met. 3 years ago, David began, his voice steady, "My wife Sarah was killed by a drunk driver. That driver was Victoria Harrison. For 3 years my daughter Emma and I lived without knowing who had taken Sarah from us, without justice, without closure." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I could stand here today and tell you about our pain, about the nights Emma cried for her mommy, about the struggles of raising a child alone, about the financial hardships we faced. All of that would be true." David looked at Victoria again. "But I also want to tell you about the night that changed everything. The night when the woman who killed my wife was too drunk to drive home safely, and I chose to help her anyway. I chose kindness over anger, compassion over revenge. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. That choice didn't make what happened to Sarah okay. It didn't erase our pain or bring my wife back. But it did something else. It showed both Victoria and me who we really were when faced with a moral choice. She chose to confess, to face the consequences of her actions, even though she could have stayed silent forever. I chose to forgive not because she deserved it, but because Sarah would have wanted me to choose love over hate. David's voice broke slightly as he continued. Emma is growing up knowing that her mother was taken from us by someone who made a terrible choice. But she's also growing up knowing that people can change, that confession and redemption are possible, and that kindness can transform even the darkest situations. He looked directly at Victoria as he spoke his final words. I forgive you, Victoria. Not for your sake but for mine and Emma's. We choose to move forward without the burden of hatred. We choose to honor Sarah's memory by living with love, not anger. Victoria was openly weeping now, as were many others in the courtroom. The judge wiped his own eyes before pronouncing the sentence. After the trial, David used the money from Victoria's confession bonus and the settlement from the civil suit to start a foundation in Sarah's name, dedicated to preventing drunk driving and supporting families affected by impaired driving accidents. He left Harrison and Associates and found a job with better hours and a more compassionate work environment. Emma thrived. She excelled in school, made friends easily, and grew up to be kind and forgiving like her father, but with a quiet strength that reminded David of Sarah every day. Victoria served 6 years of her 8-year sentence, getting out early for good behavior. When she was released, she found a letter waiting for her, from David. It was brief but warm, letting her know that he and Emma were doing well and that they held no grudge against her. She never tried to contact them directly, respecting their privacy and their healing. Instead, she quietly donated to Sarah's foundation every year, working a modest job and living a simple life, trying every day to earn the forgiveness she had been given. Years later, when Emma was 16 and learning to drive, David told her the whole story. She listened quietly, processing the information, then asked the question that had been on her mind since she was old enough to understand that her mother had died in an accident. Do you really forgive her, Daddy? David thought for a long moment before answering. Forgiveness isn't a one-time thing, Emma. It's a choice you make every day. Some days it's easier than others. But yes, I forgive her. Because holding on to anger would have poisoned our lives, and your mother would never have wanted that. Emma nodded, then surprised him with her next words. I want to meet her someday. Not now, but someday. I want to tell her that I forgive her too. David's eyes filled with tears as he pulled his daughter close. Your mother would be so proud of the woman you're becoming. The story of David Miller and Victoria Harrison became something of a legend in their city, a testament to the power of kindness, the possibility of redemption, and the healing that can come from choosing love over hate. It was a reminder that even in our darkest moments, we have the power to choose who we want to be. And in a small apartment across town, where a father and daughter had learned to build a life filled with love despite their loss, Sarah's memory lived on, not in anger or bitterness, but in the kindness they showed to others, even to those who had hurt them most. The night that had started with humiliation and ended with a shocking confession had indeed changed everything. But perhaps the most shocking thing of all was not Victoria's admission of guilt, but David's choice to respond with grace. In a world that often seems determined to tear people down, their story stood as proof that redemption is possible, that forgiveness can heal even the deepest wounds, and that sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply choosing to be better than those who hurt us. Emma grew up knowing that her father had faced the woman who killed her mother with compassion instead of hatred. She learned that strength isn't always about fighting back. Sometimes it's about choosing kindness when kindness seems impossible. And she carried that lesson with her as she became a woman, a mother, and eventually, a leader in her own right. The foundation that bore her mother's name grew and flourished, preventing countless tragedies and helping thousands of families heal from their own losses. And at its heart was a simple truth that David had learned on one cold December night. That even in our darkest hours, we have the power to choose light.